Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever it is you are. Hey guys, hope you're having a blessed week. Hope everything is going fantastic. Today we are going to dive into the history of another decade. You'll recall we talked about the decade of the 1920s. Now we're going to talk about the decade of the 1950s. And this is a really unique decade, not only for the changes that came about during the 1950s. There's a unique economic boom that happened. You've got the baby boom that's going on. There's a suburban boom that goes on. In fact, I think referring to the 1950s as a boom period is a good way to look at it. But the 1950s also witnessed kind of the beginnings of the civil rights movement. And there's just a lot of unique changes going on. Obviously, you've got the Cold War taking place. And all of these forces really shape the history of this decade. But perhaps what makes this decade so unique is that in the memory of American history, the 1950s sort of represents kind of a golden period, a time in which the nuclear family was held together, a time in which family values were strong and suburban neighborhoods reflected a more pristine and simpler way of life. And for some folks, that might very well be true, but that image is somewhat wrought with inaccuracies, because when we think about the 1950s as being a time in which the nuclear family lived in a suburban home, and you've got mom in the kitchen and dad going out to the job, and the kids are going to Boy Scouts and Little League practices and Girl Scouts and what have you. That type of life was fairly reflective of white middle class Americans. It didn't necessarily reflect the lives of all Americans. But one of the things that you hear, or at least I have heard throughout my life, is that this was kind of a golden age. If we could just go back to the 1950s. And so, this time period sort of lives large and looms large in our minds. It says here that the popular memory of the 1950s has romanticized this decade as a time of great prosperity, decadence, possibility, and a time when the nuclear family and all the values associated with it were at a peak. But the other reality of the 1950s is that it was a time fraught with anxiety and fear. We've talked about the Cold War, but the 1950s, if you take a look at the 1950s, you're going to know there's a lot of people freaked out about communism, right? Freaked out about potential nuclear holocaust. There is free speech movements about to happen. You've got the rise of the beatnik generation. You've got rebels without a cause. You've got the civil rights movement. So, when we talk about the 1950s, what we want to make sure that we do is that we think about the 1950s in every way that we possibly can. Not just the way in which popular shows of the day, which are oftentimes still portrayed, represent the 1950s. I mean, if you've ever watched an episode of Father Knows Best or Leave It to Beaver, then you've seen kind of what popular culture of the day thought American society should look like. Okay, even shows like I Love Lucy sort of reflect some of those ideas, although that particular show sort of pushed the boundaries of the status quo during the 1950s. But with that said, one of the things we need to be very aware of about this decade is that it was a boom period. This very much was a time, and excuse me, I'm looking at my notes here. This was a time in which the economy was exploding. This was a time in which consumerism absolutely became the way of life. It states here that between 1945 and 1960, the gross national product more than doubled, growing from 200 billion to more than 500 billion. People are buying goods. They're buying a range of items from homes. Suburban neighborhoods begin to pop up all over the place. The first major suburban tract housing would have been built by Levitt, William Levitt, in Levittown. And so if you've ever lived in a house that seems to be like cookie cutter, all the houses look to be the same, and you've got your little plot of grass in your backyard, right, in your barbecue, that's fairly iconic of the 1950s. Suburban living. Automobiles, people are buying cars in massive ways. The automobile becomes a mechanism by which people are not only able to transport themselves, but cars themselves become status symbols. You know, it told people what you could buy, what you were about, what type of job you had, right? It's not just a utilitarian vehicle anymore. It's something that's going to be a status symbol, right? It says here, increased prosperity by the mid-1950s. Nearly 60% of Americans were members of the middle class. The middle class is fairly large during the 1950s. People are buying their homes, they're buying cars, they're buying appliances to go in those homes. Many folks are traveling to places like California to take vacations, right? Here in the book America, George Tyndall writes the following: innovations in financing made it easier to buy things. The first credit card appeared in 1949. Soon, buying with plastic had become the new norm. In fact, during the 1950s, credit exploded, right? All kinds of different kinds of credit exploded, right? It says personal indebtedness doubled and frugality became unpatriotic, right? One of the things that was true about American society during the 1930s and 1940s is that thrift and frugality and living sparsely, those were the values associated with being a patriotic American. But now that's not the case. During the 1950s, that changes to being someone who spends and buys. And the way in which people are spending and buying begins to change, not only because of the implementation of the credit card, but the where and the way and the how of shopping changes, right? Supermarkets, large department stores, they begin to dot the landscape. Now, these things sort of existed before the 1950s, but just recognize that things are rapidly changing and American society is rapidly shifting. And it says what most Americans wanted to buy was a new house. In 1945, only 40% of Americans owned homes. By 1960, the number had increased to 60%. And the homes that they're buying are oftentimes pre-manufactured, prefabricated homes. And you could buy these houses fairly cheaply, just a little bit of money down, $500 down. Maybe the house costs $19,000. It's, compared to today, this is very cheap. And you could get the house fully furnished, right? And so the American dream begins to wrap itself around this idea that you can own a home. And if you work hard, then you'll be promoted and you can buy better clothes. You can buy better, cars. You can go on more vacations. And one of the interesting things that happens in the 1950s is that home life becomes very centered around children. If you take a look at 1950s suburban neighborhoods, children are very central to the entire thing, right? You're talking about mothers taking their children to the swimming pools and Little League and PTA meetings. The household itself becomes kind of a center of child rearing. And as one advertisement said, people are beginning to realize that children are real beings with real emotions and feelings, right? And if you were a white middle-class child during the 1950s, life would have been very, very good for you. I mean, I remember hearing an interview with one woman who described the presents that she got as a child, and at the very end she said, it was great. There wasn't anything I could have asked for, right? She got everything she could ever want during the 1950s. And to sort of foreshadow this getting all that you could ever want, this consumeristic mentality is actually going to come back to bite many Americans because it's going to give rise to the Beat generation and then ultimately to the counterculture of the 1960s. And these folks begin to become very uneasy with a consumer society or a society that becomes so filled and valued upon buying and consuming things, right? As opposed to dealing with social problems and political corruption and what have you, people are just consumed with obtaining stuff. But it makes sense, right? It makes sense that this generation of Americans would want to consume things because if you think about their lives before the 1950s, they didn't have anything. They went through the Depression where they couldn't get anything, and then they went through the 1940s during World War II where they were asked to conserve and not purchase. And so now, when they have an opportunity to buy things, because goods are being mass produced and they're low in price and wages are high for certain folks. So they begin to buy these items, right? But not everybody has access to these new goods, right? We think about African Americans, for example, and the reality is, and it's a deeply unfortunate one, is that many of these suburban neighborhoods were segregated, and they were deliberately segregated. One of the things you need to be aware of that happens during the 1920s, 30s, 40s, is there is a wave of African Americans leaving the American South, and they begin to move into northern and western urban centers. That is, they begin to move into the cities. And what happens is that when African Americans begin to make their way into the cities, where predominantly white people had lived, white people had brought their money into the cities, cities were growing and developing, new industries were coming into the cities. But when African Americans arrived in mass, what you saw was a process known as white flight. White people began to leave the cities. They began to move into suburban neighborhoods. They have the cars to drive from their suburban home into the urban area to work and then back again. And when white flight happened, it meant that all the money, all the resources, because unfortunately, the unfortunate and hard fact is that during this time, more white people were affluent than African Americans or Latino Americans or Japanese Americans or others. White folks tended to have more money. They had more affluence. And so when white people left the cities and went into the suburbs, what that did is it meant that all the resources that were in the cities now moved into the suburbs. And cities, what you saw was urban decline and suburban renewal or suburban development. Well, as many of these suburban neighborhoods, and this includes Levittown, there was definitely criticism of William Levitt for this, but one of the things that you're going to find is that the opportunities afforded to white middle-class Americans in these neighborhoods during the 1950s, right? When you take a look at pop culture, when you take a look at the films and the movies and the TV shows, and it shows home life, right? Really what you see are white Americans living up this type of American ideal. In many of these suburban white neighborhoods, African Americans simply couldn't get access to those neighborhoods, right? There were restrictive covenants that would be put into place. For example, a restrictive covenant, and I'm reading from my notes, it says these were covenants that restricted the sale or occupation of real property on the basis of race, ethnicity, and religion, right? You would have mortgage discrimination, wherein banks would not lend money to African Americans to get a loan or a mortgage loan to get their house. And if an African American did happen to move into a predominantly white neighborhood, they could find themselves racially targeted, or you'll see white flight happen again. And it's deeply troubling. It's deeply problematic by all accounts. It's one of these things that we need to be aware of, I think. It says here in the Tyndall book, it says, initially, the contracts for houses in Levittown specifically excluded members of other than the Caucasian race, right? Think about that. It says, when asked about this racial covenant, Levitt blamed prevailing prejudices. And he writes, or said, quote, if we sell one house to a Negro family, then 90 to 95% of our white customers will not buy into the community. His policy was, quote, we can solve a housing problem or we can try to solve a racial problem, but we can't combine the two, right? And the reality is that, unfortunately, what Levitt is sort of identifying here is an economic discrepancy and not just a racial one. There's obviously a prejudicial racial issue going here, but if white folks have most of the money, then what you want to do is to cater to those people so that you can bring more affluence in. And so the 1950s is, in one sense, this kind of iconic golden age, depending upon who you were. But on the other side, it wasn't, because there was tension here. The 1950s is also unique because one of the things you're going to find is that it begins to look, that is, society begins to look very homogenous. The houses look the same. We dress the same, we act the same, we eat the same foods. Part of the reason for that is popular culture. Television shows sort of reinforced those values and those ideals. But so did communism. One of the things you didn't want to do was to look different or act different, lest you be accused of being a communist. And so what you do is you sort of become a very homogenized society. And that's actually one of the things that the beatnik generation, like Jack Kerouac and others, are going to rail against. That society was just too much the same and it was meaningless, right? You look at some of the films of the day, like James Dean's Rebel Without a Cause, right? There are folks and youth in American society who are rebelling against the sameness of it all, right? And there was a lot of adults who blamed comic books on youth delinquency. They blamed, of course, rock and roll music. Many people thought that was the devil's music. And in fact, rock and roll music was an interesting phenomenon at the time. It was obviously a blend of multiple types of music: country, jazz, R&B, and what have you. Well, not less R&B, but bluegrass music, country music, jazz music, rhythm and blues, I suppose, R&B, yeah. At any rate, it's a blend of all this music, and it largely is coming out of African-American culture. And what's interesting about it is that the white community, in many ways, sort of co-opted it. And if you really dig into the history of rock and roll and what it was, you can begin to explore racial tensions. One of the things that is very interesting is you had one disc jockey, and I can't remember his name, Fred, maybe something Fred, I can't remember. At any rate, the disc jockey once said, and I quote, he said, and I quote, "If I can find a white man that can sing like a black man, then I would make $1 million." And some argue that this isn't a racial comment, and I tend to sort of feel that it is, but what it does underscore is that if you were a black artist in the United States at this time, even if your music was liked, it wasn't going to be as accepted by the white community as if it was a white man singing it. Now the reality is white kids, black and white kids, all kids, they tended to like rock and roll music, but Elvis the Pelvis Presley was that individual who sounded like a black man but was not a black man, and of course he became probably the king of rock and roll, as he was, right? He became the epitome of that. So as you think about rock and roll music in the 1950s and kids listening to this music on their transistor radios, right? One of the things you have to understand is that that music, as well as the ability to have access to a car, it contributes to the development and formation of a youth culture that had never existed before. And some parents thought that this was deeply troubling, and they were very concerned about what their children were doing. Of course, we know some of what they were doing in those cars on Lover's Lane, right? But nonetheless, the 1950s has a lot to think through, and of course, I'm already over my time, but there's a lot for you to take in this week. So, try to process this. Try to think through your own perceptions of what the 1950s were, right? What do you think about when you think of the 1950s? What comes to mind? Does nuclear holocaust come to mind? Does Leave It to Beaver come to mind? What comes to mind, right? Think through that. Implement those opinions, those ideas into your responses for this week, and I'll be interested to hear what you have to say. So, as always, if you have questions or concerns, contact me, let me know. Otherwise, as always, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you, live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, guys.